We're very happy this evening to have Deborah Anton, the Interim National Data Commissioner, to speak to us on Dharma, data, the APS, Community Expectations on data reforms. It's a fascinating topic and I'm looking forward to it, for one. Before we start, some housekeeping. In the event of emergency, calmly follow the instructions of staff. The bathrooms are out that door on the right, just through there. I should tell you about the Dharma Certified Data Management Professional Certification. I'm seeing copies of DMBOK on people's desks, Data Management Body of Knowledge on people's desks more and more these days. Well, look, you can even become certified in it. There are some of us, I'm one of them. It's a worthwhile thing. We have more stuff coming up. In 2 weeks' time, we have a joint IIM Dharma seminar in the afternoon here, in fact upstairs here. It's our AI at Work series. We have speakers on the practical use and experiences implementing artificial intelligence. Ethics is the particular topic, with some excellent speakers. A reminder that Dharma has several special interest groups that run on various cycles. The Data Governance SIG meets quarterly. The Data Modelling SIG meets every second month, and Emerging Data Designs meets quarterly as well. Let me see, Tim's over there, Andy's down there, Selva's up the back of the room, so encourage you to talk to them if you like. More housekeeping. We have some elections coming up for Dharma Australia. So the process has changed a little bit. The Canberra branch executive have to nominate 2 people for the National Executive Committee by the 24th, and then there's going to be an AGM, a physical AGM on the 31st. That's Thursday the 31st, and it's going to be here. I'm sure there'll be an email shortly. At the same time, we're going to, well, alongside of that, we're going to have some elections for the Canberra branch. I can stop being an interim branch chair and we can sort that out. So we'll email this out, but the nominations for the Canberra branch are now open and will close on the 24th. So contact myself or Tim if you want to get role descriptions or nominate or be nominated. We'll circulate some stuff on the 24th, and we are going to lead practice for Dharma in Australia and do an online survey instead of having a physical turn up and vote type thing. For constitutional reasons, the National Executive can't do that yet, but we're going to do it for our branch. And then we'll send an email out. We have more meetings coming up for the Canberra branch. The 19th of November, we have Mac Bryler from Tableau talking about data culture and data literacy. We have a program under development for next year, so we'll have a nice monthly program next year, a mixture of big topics and agency topics. And now to Deb. No, that one. Here we go. There you are. Welcome.
Thanks, Simon, for kicking us off today. I'm a quiet speaker, so hopefully, can you hear me through that thing? Good. Hopefully that will then work for the technology as well. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and I pay my respect to their cultures, country, elders both past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us today or who are live streaming in to the event. And next step, I'd like to express my thanks to the Canberra branch of Dharma for the opportunity to speak about the importance of public service data reform and the work that we're doing at the Office of the National Data Commissioner. Our vision really, in many ways, is to make sure that public service is generating more value from the data that we hold, but to do that effectively, we do need to have a conversation about data management and maturing our practices and procedures. So this is a much broader story. I thought I'd begin today by reflecting a little bit on why I got interested in data. Those of you who've heard me reflect on this before, I apologise if I'm going over old ground. But the story began for me, well, the one that stands out was when I was looking after a program called Enterprise Connect, which has now become part of the Entrepreneurs program in the industry department. As at the time when we had one of those commission of audits happening, I'm sure you remember those. And I said to my staff, well, how do we know this program's making a difference? The program essentially sent a coach in to work with a business with the idea of helping them grow, improve their skills and capabilities. And I said, okay, well, objectively, is this actually working? And I said, well, we've got some great case studies and firms who've had phenomenal success. And people generally like the program, like, that's great, but it's not an objective measure. How would we get one? It was a bit difficult because you're doing a specific intervention. The answer that came back from my staff was, well, what if we could run a virtual experiment? What if we could look at firms that had similar characteristics at the same point in the market and actually looked at their growth pattern? Did our intervention help those firms grow, whereas those who didn't actually have the intervention, they weren't growing? So how would we do that? And the answer came back, well, we could ask the ABS to look at tax data and try and come up with some matches. We actually weren't allowed to see the data, but it gave us a point of comparison and a starting point. Now, an economist would tell you there was selection bias involved in our samples because somebody had volunteered to be part of our program, but it gave us something. And the only reason we could do that is because we were actually comparing data that we wouldn't have otherwise had access to. So that for me as a senior manager was a breakthrough in what was possible with data in terms of program evaluation. There were some other conversations I participated in at a similar point that were talking about, I think, data as infrastructure, about our geo-positioning work. Do we know where we are in Australia? And the government on the back of that made some pretty significant investments in improving that. And there was some work I did at IP Australia, which I'll come back to later. So all of those things really extended my experience and had me thinking, well, this thing called data can actually serve us better if we think a bit laterally about what it can do. Another person who's been reflecting recently on the value of data is David Kalish. Some of you may be from the ABS. He is coming to the end of his term as the Australian statistician and has made the point more broadly about the importance of data as critical national infrastructure. Obviously, his insights come from looking at what's happening at both a national and international level. And I think for David, obviously, at the ABS, data is at the core of the work that they do and informs any number of policy decisions. Coming from another important stakeholder in my world, Minister Robert, who is the Minister for Human Services and also our responsible minister, he's very focused on how do we use data to improve service delivery, to improve the experiences of consumers and citizens who expect a similar level of services that they receive from the banks, from government. That requires that we do more with the data that we have. I chose A Time to Grow for the title of this speech because we're really still in the middle of a growth phase with data, where people have realised it's an important thing and we need to maximise the value, but there is still a long way to go, as I'm sure the people in this room appreciate. The work that I'm leading in the Office of the National Data Commissioner is about a significant reform to how we're managing data, but is by no means the only thing that needs to happen if we're actually to make the most of what we're doing with data. The reforms that we're leading, and I guess why we're having a conversation about this now, is that technology is part of the reason why people are really realising that more can be done with data. And we can use it to make more of the existing data sets, advances in analytics, have improved our ability to actually understand correlations and connections between data and new in different ways. And that example of what we were doing with the Enterprise Connect program is an example. For those, I'm presuming there's a predominance of public servants or people serving public service agencies in this room. The core of that needs to be, how do we actually deliver better services, researchers, undertake better research and develop programs and policies. Making the most of data, though, I think involves a bit of a step change for the public service in terms of being able to view it not just as a byproduct of the work that we do, as we often do with programs, but actually seeing it as a valuable research resource in its own right that needs to be managed appropriately. Data has to be managed and used dynamically in the same way as the other assets of organisations, be it about the people or their IT systems, their intellectual property or their real estate. That requires deliberate effort and thought. But it has to be managed beyond its immediate purpose. One of my staff came up with this rather amusing slide for me. But I just wanted to reflect on the fact that it's also important that we ground our understanding of what's possible with data in reality. We can talk about, there's a lot, we've got our, technology has made more possible, and that's terrific, but it actually still, we need to have expectations that are grounded in reality as well. The reality is our data sets often don't align cleanly with each other. We've got legacy IT systems and legacy legislative provisions that were crafted before we thought about using data for a different purpose. So you actually have to look at what you've got before you can understand what it might do. From the perspective of my office, we're really working on legislation to overcome a particular problem, which is how does the legislation support or not support data sharing and reuse? At the moment, there are over 500 secrecy and other provisions in 176 pieces of Commonwealth legislation that are potential barriers to data sharing because they've been written over 100 years and written in different forms for different reasons. So what we're actually trying to do then with the work and the legislation particularly is to create a common practice, to create best practice for a new world where more is possible that offers consistency. The legislation we're working on is not something that has to be used by agency, but it creates an alternate pathway, and I hope it creates a solid foundation for people to move forward from. Because the reality is data is valuable. Public service agencies need to understand that, and leaders in agencies need to understand that, and that it can be used for more than just that original purpose. It is valuable, but to understand its true value, you have to explore its potential. And a key element of exploring its potential is recognising that attitudes also need to change. I've made the point before that I think we need to, effective use of data means managing and engaging with risk. And I've made the point before, I think as public servants, we're not necessarily risk averse, we're actually mistake averse. I think that's a more accurate description. We want to do the right thing, but if we're not sure what the right thing is, how can we make a judgment? How can we explain to somebody further up the chain that actually, yes, there are some risks involved, but we understand what they are and we're dealing with them. So better use of data requires more effective risk management, and we have to make sure that risks can be managed and mitigated with the appropriate controls. And if we mitigate risks through improved, I guess really a broader effort around the improved data management, data quality, enhanced data and literacy for the workforce, then we actually start getting to something that we can use and that will deliver the value that we can see as possible. So I thought I'd just give you some practical, for those of you who haven't been on this journey with us for a while, a few practical markers on what is the office actually doing and where are we up to in our work program. The work of the Office of the National Data Commissioner really began its life with a report by the Productivity Commission into data availability and use. And the government asked the PC to have a look at government's data and say, well, how are you going with the use of that? The PC concluded that we were falling behind international counterparts. We didn't have a consistent approach. We didn't have a consistent, we were risk averse. And actually, if you wanted to do something, a step change was required. So in response to all of that, the Office of the National Data Commissioner was created. And I was appointed to this role in August of 2018. So it's now been over 12 months, and the office was stood up in July of last year. So we haven't been in existence for that long. What we've been doing in that time is very much focused on a piece of legislation. How can we craft a piece of legislation that will empower government agencies to safely share data with trusted users for specified purposes, so we can streamline our practices across the public service? Now, getting that right and overcoming some of those barriers around secrecy and privacy is actually a challenge, because if we're proposed to actually share more and do more with data, then you've actually got to make sure that you've got the right safeguards in place as well. The Productivity Commission made the cautionary note in its report, this is all stuff that you need to do, but you have to take the public with you, because this is an area where trust is critical if you actually want to do something more. And I'll come back and reflect on those themes at the moment. So the reality is public sector data has to actually be used safely for the right purposes by the right people with privacy and security at its core. One of those key concepts of trust is actually being competent and demonstrating that we're competent with what we're doing. In terms of the legislation that we're looking at, what we're trying to do is make sure that data custodians are responsible for making decisions about what can and what could be shared. There's a clear distinction in the design that we've proposed. It's not FOI, it's not for somebody to overrule the data custodians. It's because, in our view, the people best able to assess benefits against risks are those who manage the data, not me as the data commissioner. Rather, the work of my office will focus in a slightly different place. And really, what's important is the legislation is focused on sharing in controlled conditions. I'll give you the next slide. One of the challenges of working in this data space is it's still emerging, so we really don't have consistent language. We're often talking about different concepts, so we spend a lot of time in our consultations with people just starting with some basic concepts. So let me just, for the sake of this presentation, be really clear about what we're talking about for the legislation. From my point of view, there's a spectrum of public service data. There's some that's open, which is open to the public domain. We all use apps that pull on the bomb data for the weather. I think at the state government level, we're doing there's some great stuff about, is the bus running on time? That's really helpful. All of that's open data. That's great. There's, at the other end of the spectrum, closed data. The information that national security agencies has security classifications on, that's not something that is easily shared, and nor should it be. But there's this in-between component that isn't appropriate for public release, that does have sensitivities, that we believe can be shared so long as we've got the right controls in place. And that's actually the area where we think there is an opportunity to improve what we're doing and actually make more of the data, whether it's sharing between government agencies or sharing with researchers. It's sharing with people who have a clue what they're doing with data and have demonstrated that they have that. And it's also about sharing for a purpose that actually will generate a public benefit. There's got to be a good reason to do it. There was some language for me that came out as sort of coming out of Europe, if you think about our goal, which is, in essence, we want to make data as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So let's make it open to the people who can use it, but if it shouldn't be open, don't do it. And that's what risk management is about. And often you can't deal with risk at a macro level. It is about that case-by-case assessment. So a lot of the work that we're doing is providing a foundation for the public service to follow us and actually then make those assessments. But, of course, finding the balance of how you develop that framework in a way that is accessible to the community is really important. So I'm going to come back and I'll talk in a moment about where have we got to with the community, but this was a presentation that was to Dharma. So I wanted to just pause for a minute because I've got a lot of information I'm trying to convey. And I thought I would reflect for you how I came into contact with Dharma. What was my starting point? So as the Deputy Director at IP Australia, and it's lovely that Andy's in the room, IP Australia is the organisation that administers patent, trademarks, plant breeders' rights, that sort of stuff. I was the Deputy Director, and we had a couple of data investment decisions, thoughts come up to our investment committee, and the DG or Secretary at the time said, Deb, can you go and figure out what we should be doing with that? So I collected up the brains trust of people within IP Australia who had, who I think really knew what was possible to do with data, and we worked on what would a data strategy look like, what were the basics, and Andy, who's here today and was mentioned in the early slides, brought a copy of the DMBOK into my office and said, Deb, I think this might be useful to you. Okay. And it was a great gift. For me, I think, sorry, there's a lovely copy of the DMBOK at somebody's desk, because yes, we are seeing more of that. The thing that really stood out for me, as I think my guys have put it, the wheel of understanding, it's just the wheel. The wheel really helped me because often, I like conceptual models. When you're coming into data cold, it's really, where do you start? The wheel was really critical for a couple of things. Importantly, when talking, for me, just in understanding what were all the factors and that people were telling me this, like it gave me a reference point. It was also important in being able to convey to senior executives in my organisation that there was no silver bullet. As senior executives, we often like a simple answer. The reality is there are a series of connected factors you actually have to deal with. Sorry, I know you guys know this. I just thought I'd reflect on how did I use this when talking to senior managers, because that might be of value to you. Honestly, a picture picture is worth 1,000 words. I just put that in front of them and went, look, it's all a bit complicated, but guess where we need to start? We need to start with data governance. We need to be deliberate about what we're doing. We need to think it through. And look, as it turned out, we used the wheel as a way of doing a sort of maturity assessment and presenting that to executives. So, look, I found the DMBOK a tome in the best way, and a story I heard after this came back to me only in the last couple of months. I had the DMBOK on my desk and I'd flick through it as I needed to make sure I kind of understood where the technical experts were up to in doing my job. And somebody outside the organisation commented to me, he said, you know that people were really intimidated by you because of that book. I was like, what do you mean? He said, seriously, you're an executive with a book that looks like that on your desk and you've read it and understand it, and I'm thinking, oh, I haven't necessarily read every word, to be fair. But one of my direct report was quite intimidated that I would go to that effort to get through the concepts. The reality is I dipped into the bits I needed to understand because I had a group of experts to advise me. And that is the balance between being a senior management and being a data expert, and part of my job was to bridge the gap. But it gave me a conceptual model to think through and be able to talk with people in a really frank way. Now, I still come back to the Dharma wheel when I started this job to understand what is the job that we are doing in the Office of the National Data Commissioner. And I think it's also fair to say what we are doing is we're sitting in the middle of that wheel around data governance, to think about how does the public service actually work in a consistent way. So it remains a very important tool and part of, I guess, just my foundational thinking and mental model. And look, as I think we had earlier, we're seeing it on desks, and I'm also seeing it come back to my staff, and Heather in particular has been involved in a lot of the data management communities. We're seeing it come back through presentations by different government agencies who are using this as a tool and a way of thinking. So that segue done. Let me bring you back to the task of legislation, which is kind of where we're up to right now. Noting the PC made the point that the public have to actually trust you. If you want to do more with data and in this environment, you need to build trust. Part of developing the legislation has been having a pretty intense consultation process. So we've had roundtable submissions, ongoing bilateral and multilateral meetings, and we've used those to build our knowledge. So we've really been doing this now for 12 months, and in that time, we've now held 76 half-day workshops, roundtables with people. We've just finished last week the last lot of 24 on the basis of a discussion paper released. If you haven't had a look at it, encourage you to do so. Submissions close today, so if you were going to make a submission that's passed, at last count, because I had people sending me numbers. We had 55 submissions and we were expecting another dozen or so, because I think COB in the modern world means at some point by the end of the day. So that's a pretty significant level of interest in a piece of public service reform, and we've had a lot of stakeholders come along to those meetings. What I thought I would do for you today was just to give you some reflections on what are the key things that they're raising with us, what are the conversations that have been taking place in those roundtables. We haven't looked at the submissions yet, they are just trickling in today, but the key themes. And I thought I would do that against the backdrop of 4 key groups, because there are different people who come to this conversation with different interests. Civil society, researchers, industry and government departments. And even within government I could probably split that between Commonwealth and state because they've got slightly different questions. Starting with civil society, probably that key theme that comes up there, and this is going back to that concern around trust, is privacy, consent and security, with consent being a particular theme that keeps coming up. And really, it's important to acknowledge and recognise their concerns and then go back and say, okay, can we design a risk management framework and a process that actually helps mitigate that? So the legislation itself, we've taken a privacy by design approach. We've had a privacy impact assessment done as we've been going along, and we'll continue to do that to say, yes, we know there are risks, but how can we manage them? But it's often not the start, I think, the wrong place to start asking the questions. It's a really important control. But in a conversation, even about consent, what plays out in those conversations is that people are willing to think about, are the controls okay? But they're only willing to do that if they're convinced that the reasons we want to share are legitimate and that there's a good public benefit. So it's really important to understand with this legislation, before you even get to the question of controls, there's still actually got to be a good reason for sharing in the first place. And that's actually a really important aspect of building trust, is this has to be for a good reason. So that's one of that consent often comes up as a starting point though, and I think it's a way of people trying to grapple with, well, is this actually a good idea? And if I'm not sure if it's a good idea, then I'd rather have control about that. But the point that we made in the discussion paper and has continued through a series of conversations is consent's not always feasible. It can skew your answers actually, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with privacy, and that's often one of the tools that you use to do that. And to be perfectly frank, not all the data that we deal with in government is sensitive. I'm sure there are people in this room who are dealing with data that the concept of consent isn't even relevant because, I don't know, maybe environmental data. Again, you've actually got to look at things on a case-by-case basis. My hope is, again, if we've got the treatments right in this legislation, there has to be a good purpose. We're being particular about who we're sharing with. There is a data sharing agreement that's published, so there is transparency and people know what we're doing, that people are more willing to engage with the concepts that we can share data and actually do something useful with it. In contrast, if civil society is concerned about, well, should we be sharing it all, or do you need more controls about consent? The research community is concerned that the legislation doesn't empower the National Data Commissioner to overturn data custodians when they're not willing to share and say, actually, you should be sharing. So their concerns are actually coming from a quite different point of view. Researchers want to help us make the most of the data that we have for the public because they actually also are motivated generally by a public interest. For them, the response is, for me, I guess coming from a regulatory perspective, is at a first principle, when you're doing regulation, you start by what is the minimum that we can do to try and affect the behaviour change that we want in the system. So we're starting by saying to data custodians, here is a set of rules, here is a way you can share data, go away and assess the public benefit. And one of the things the National Data Commissioner will be able to then do is say, well, how is this information, how is the legislation being used? And if people are saying no, why are they saying no? What's actually going on there? Because we know, talking to data custodians, the concerns are often about more than just the legislation. It may be about data quality, it may be about the amount of work that would have to go into something to pull that data out. There are there's a range of reasons, but unless you actually start asking the questions and thinking about it and monitoring it in a more deliberate way, we're not actually going to be able to mature the system. We've had a significant conversation in this round of discussion also about commercial use. It was one of the questions that we put in the paper to say we get mixed views from people on commercial use. Should Commonwealth data be able to be used? Now, to be really clear, this is not talking about data sharing or selling government data. This is actually saying, are there instances where there may be benefit to the public by sharing public service data? And I think we can see what the benefits of sharing transport data is. The reality, and I think where the conversations have gone with the public, or certainly in the public consultations we've done, is it depends. There are circumstances where it actually might be of benefit, but it's very much a case-by-case basis. So again, we're left with how do we design a set of questions for people to ask so that when they're in that moment they can make those considerations, because it's potentially quite hard to make a hard and fast rule. So there is a lot of this that how you engage with risk often depends on, well, what are the benefits and what will that do to a market? So we've still got work to do to strike that right balance. To government agencies, and we have conversations beyond obviously the consultation, we've developed this legislation through a co-design process with the public service about how can we design something that's useful to you. There are still questions about, well, if people are asking for data, how will we manage the logistics of that process? So we are doing work on what would a standard data sharing agreement look like, how would people apply in a consistent way, because I think there is value in public service operating on a consistent basis there. State governments are interested in how would we generate a national system. We know there are clear examples where Commonwealth and state working together can get a better outcome. At a minimum, they could apply for access to Commonwealth data using this legislation. So that's the starting point for their inclusion. But we're also building on the foundations that state governments have put in place with similar legislation. We're all gravitating towards using the 5 Safes framework as a consistent risk management approach. That will help us get to a national approach effectively. It's one way of getting commonality. But the one thing that we all need, be it Commonwealth or state, is trust. And I think it's one area of government that one of the few areas of government I've worked in where there is a genuine sense of it being a brains trust exercise, that we're all in this together, because our success and how well we all collectively do with this data sharing, or where we have failings, that's what impacts the public's consciousness. And trust is such a vital ingredient that we do need to work together. And there's certainly a great attitude of how do we just share best practice, because we're all grappling with the same challenges and the same maturity and change processes. And going back to my earlier point, trust begins with there has to be a good reason why we're doing this. That's the key lesson for me, one of the key lessons from the consultation. We have to be able to explain the use case to the public. The other thing is demonstrating competence. So being able to say there are controls in place. I gave my mother the sharing data. We developed, I'll come to that in a second, ways to assist with growing maturity, but a package called the Data Sharing Principles. And then we did a public version of that document. And I gave it to my mum and said, all right, we're thinking of doing more data sharing. Here's one of my explanations. And she said, oh, well, I like that thing about you only do it where there's a good reason. It's just common sense. But we need to remind ourselves of that and remind the public that we're not doing this just willy-nilly. Often I think it's not helpful when you have TV shows that just kind of go, oh, they just smash all the data together and they can identify every person in every circumstance. It's not actually our lived reality. I think a more common reality is it's stuck in silos and it takes a lot of effort to extract it and figure out how to do it properly. But TV can make anything possible. So coming back to how can we as an office and what have we done to help assist the public service grow in its maturity? We've already released this product in March of this year, which was best practice in applying the data sharing principles. So how can we share data safely? What are the considerations? And that was the stuff that drew on the 5 Safes model. That's available from the website, so feel free to go and grab that. And there is also an accompanying a document that I can give to my mum that says what are the things we need to talk about. So going, for those of you familiar with 5 Safes, it's asking a series of questions about, well, why are you sharing the data? Is this the right data to share? In what environment are you sharing? What controls do you need to put in place? So it's the logical questions you would ask to do something safely. The second thing, and this is important because that framework will be really critical in how the legislation's applied. You have to have a good reason, you have to be able to demonstrate how you are managing risk. They're the 2 first conditions before you get anywhere. The other thing that my office has been working on, which I don't have a slide for, is a document that we're calling the Foundational 4. So one of the things I do in my job is go and talk to a whole bunch of agencies across the public service, and this won't surprise you, but they have different levels of data maturity. So I've gone into some agencies because an executive's invited me in and said, could you make the point that we need to do this stuff and it's really important? Okay, I can say data management's really important. The government had this open data statement in 2015 that said you need to make data open by default. Do you even know what you have? That would be a good starting point. So what I didn't want to see was for us to put a piece of legislation into the public domain without, in an accompanying way, saying to the public service, okay, well, what are some of the things you need to do? So I go and talk about just data maturity, pay attention to data, stuff that you guys know and is blindingly obvious to you, but isn't necessarily obvious if you haven't tripped across high data as a new concept. I think the general awareness is raising though. So the idea of the Foundational 4 was, to some extent, about what are the, really just as it suggests, what are the basics, which is the idea that you should have data leadership, have somebody thinking about this. Data strategy is probably a good idea, data governance is important, and data discovery is also important. You've got to know what you have. So these are very foundational concepts that are not a surprise to anyone in this room, and you will also be unsurprised to note that they do draw on the DAMA and the experience of many people across the public service. So it is that common sense guide, but importantly what it also does is provides links. Where are the government agencies that have already developed data strategies? Because we need to learn from each other, but there wasn't a collection of that anywhere. So we're still finalising that document, and there are processes, as you would understand, in government, so it's got some clearance processes to get through, and I hope that will actually be released later this year and be a good resource for the public service. The other good resource and the thing that we've been participating in are things like the Data Champions network across the public service, which is about bringing people together, and also working with the Graduate Data Network. There's a bunch of enthusiastic young graduates who've worked out that data matters. It's a really nice thing and a nice concept for me to have people entering the public service going, I should expect this to be available to me and of value. What does that mean? So we need to continue encouraging that, because we do need to change culture and actually have the public service mature over time. Now, before I close out, I brought 2 books with me, and for the sake, because I just lugged them over here, I'm going to put both of them on the desk, which was, in preparing for this, I realised my life is kind of, in data, is bounded by 2 tomes, okay? I know you know what this one is, DAMA, which was my starting point in introduction to data. My introduction to this job was this tome, which is the Productivity Commission Report into Data Availability and Use. My old IP version had a lot more tags on the DM box. I don't think that's unused. I got a clean copy because I left my old one with the person who was doing my job there. But this is the other piece of work that bounds my role right now. And somewhere in between all of those, which again reinforces the complexity of the environment that you're dealing with, is a whole bunch of reading around privacy, about security, around trust, and a whole bunch of work on engaging everybody in the public service and trying to engage as many people in the public as we can. So, in closing, having just noted that there are really, this is not simple stuff, because it covers everything that we do in the public service. It covers all eventualities for all agencies to think about how do they make the most of that resource. But what leaves me with hope in this work, aside from having people who work on this and are genuinely engaged to try and help each other, which isn't the case in all areas, is that the people I've met in this space are public servants who are intelligent, they're dedicated, and they actually want to make a positive difference to the work that we are doing as public servants, and they see data as a key way of doing that. We don't often, I think, say to ourselves enough, I'm proud to be a public servant. I am proud to be a public servant. The work that we are trying to do for the Australian public is important, it matters, and that's why these reforms matter. We're not doing it just for the sake of data and because we're excited by data. We're actually doing it because we want to make a difference for the Australian public, be that in terms of service delivery or program design or just running more efficient organisations. All of those things ultimately have a positive impact on the Australian public. This group understands what is possible with data. It's also fair to say not everybody outside this room understands that. But I do think their understanding is changing. I certainly see a lot of commitment from the DepSec's data group, from senior levels of government saying we know that more is possible. But this is not something that's solved in 1, 2 or 3 minutes. I did complain to Peter Harris, who was the Commissioner, that this report actually really this is a 10-year reform program, not a 1-year reform program that he explained and articulated in that book. Because this is it's not simple stuff, it's not set and forget stuff, but I would like to leave you by encouraging you in your jobs when you go into them tomorrow. Each of those small steps adds up, and it's in each of those small changes that we actually make progress. So thank you to those of you who've contributed to our work. Thank you for those of you for just doing your day jobs, because in my view it is contributing to a more effective public service, and I would really encourage you to hold your heads high. Remember that we're in this because we want to make a difference, and thank you for taking the time to listen tonight. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so questions? I just wanted to thank you for actually, before we go to questions, I just want to thank you for that.
Do you want to speak? I don't know if you need the microphone for the sake of that.
It's a message of hope, I think, for those of us who are data people, that somebody's taking it seriously, and that someone's on our side. That's great. Thank you. So, questions? Yes, in the middle.
You've talked a lot about data sharing, openness.
Yep.
But one area I noticed that you didn't mention, and this is actually a moving area in terms of data methods of handling. There are often occasions where the data itself, for various reasons, cannot be released. What can be got through by using methods where you analyse that data and answer the questions that are needed? Like quite often with health data, drug reactions, for example, you can't release the individual data, but by getting an agency that manages that data in a controlled area, you can actually get them to analyse it in an appropriate way to get the answers required. Is the legislation going to account for that and future methodologies that will be evolved where we can actually get the answer without actually having access to that data?
So the legislation is intended to be technology agnostic. Like we're trying to make it technology neutral, because that's what you should do with good legislation, and it's principles based. So it's a key point. Your point about sometimes you don't need all the data, you just need a component of it.
No, sometimes you can get someone else that holds the data.
Yes.
To give the analysis that you need. You don't need the data at all.
Yeah, and that's actually what we did with my example of why did I get into this with Enterprise Connect. That's what ABS did that by talking to ATO as a program manager. I never saw the data, I just got actually the final outcomes. That is something that we're using more and more. I think there's another great example, and my job is really to promote use of data in all circumstances. The legislation is about overcoming some particular barriers, but the best example at the moment I have of something like that that's been used to good effect was the socioeconomic estimation around what is the independent school funding that should go to each child. So there was an old model that was developed that was done based on what is and this is oversimplifying, okay, but basically what is the income of the parents in that postcode, and that was used then as an estimation of how much each child it was paid to a school per child. Work was done in the background with the ATO, again by ABS, where Department of Education didn't need to know the details, but what they actually looked at was what was the individual income of parents, because an average doesn't necessarily give you an accurate result. So again, that work happened because data sharing by an integrating authority, so somebody like the ABS, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, was done so that then smart policy questions could be answered. So something I didn't focus on in the presentation was the legislation also envisages a role for accredited data service providers. So it's the idea that not every agency will ever, you can't expect everybody in the public service to be able to do this at the level that somebody like an AAHW or an ABS does. So the logical thought was, well, actually, could we then subcontract to those agencies to do it? Can we actually call them out as having skills and capability, and allowing public servants to actually then say, okay, again, you've got to imagine a cost recovery framework, because they do not have bottomless buckets, but say, should you actually subcontract to somebody like that? So you can ask smart questions if you've got somebody who has the smarts to manage the data in the right way, to deal with all the sensitivities we need to deal with, and still get the answer to the question. So the reform, I think we need to recognise what you've described as a really important way of actually getting the answers, and I think the reforms that we're proposing more broadly will allow that to be possible. So
sorry, I came a bit late on, I missed this, but you mentioned inspiration coming from the block.
yep.
What about inspiration from other jurisdictions overseas?
Yeah.
Invent the wheel, really? Is there anything unique about Australia that create everything from you?
Is there anything unique about Australia? Of course we should have to say yes, because our legislation is unique, our political context and our conversations are unique. What can we learn from, but coming back to your broader point, what can we learn from overseas countries? I think one of the things, and state governments, the Commonwealth is not the first to contemplate legislation like this. Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia all have data sharing legislation, although a slightly different format. So they have actually done more work than us. The Productivity Commission pointed particularly to New Zealand and the integrated data sets work that they've been doing over 10 or 15 years, the work that they did around building trust. So there is stuff that we can learn from those other environments. We're not Robinson Crusoe. I think where there are useful frameworks that people are kind of agreeing are a good foundation, we should go with that. The 5 Safes framework, which we converted into the data sharing principles, because we got feedback that it wasn't accurate to call them safe. It's about risk management. What are the things you've got to think about? That came out of the UK. So Felix Ritchie is an academic who did that. It was work done by their statistics agency that we've picked up, and I think within Australia we've kind of said, look, that's a good starting point. So there's certainly more that we can learn from other people. We're all on the same journey. Interestingly, the conversations I often have had with people from overseas, we always have a conversation about trust, of how do we do this in this environment, because partly what we can do is driven by technology, and part of the reasons people are concerned about this at this point in time is about technology. But our history is also our own. One of the points I've made is that trust conversation in Australia, it occurs against a backdrop of my health records, census, robo-debt. Those are the things that are unique to our context. We ruled out in the discussion paper the use of this legislation for compliance purposes. And that was based on feedback that people were not comfortable with a piece of legislation like this being used for compliance. It has to go in the original legislation if you actually want to share for the purpose of making a decision. So I think those are things that we're sensitised to because of our history. There's a rambling answer covering many things, sorry.
No,
so hope that's useful.
Hi Deb, just a quick question about the role of Chief Data Officers.
Yep.
And how many Chief Data Officers are there around the Commonwealth federal agencies? Because we have a lot of CIOs, but not so many CDOs. And I'm wondering what role they have to play in the agenda that we have.
So I can't give you a head count of Chief Data Officers. What I could say in the slightly over 12 months that I've been in this role, there are far more Band 2s now that I'm talking to that have been identified as Chief Data Officers. So from that, from my, seriously, when I started, there was no one at a Band 2 level that I was talking to this about. There are now a number of people that I'm talking to about at Band 2 level that have the title of Chief Data Officer, but I haven't done a head count, so I can't tell you accurately. What role do they play? Going back to the foundational 4, we've made the point in there, sorry, this is the bit that has yet to be public. Sorry, and a really practical thing, you got a tissue because hay fever's caught up with me and there might be one in my bag. Sorry, I'll just sniff until it's dead. The foundational 4 talks about the idea of anyone, I'll take anything that's unused or even my own use. Thank you, that's good. Thank you. So there was no polite way to deal with that. The foundational 4, one of the points that we make in there is actually it's important to have somebody responsible for data leadership, whether you call that a Chief Data Officer or not, because again, there's no one size fits all for this stuff. It really does depend on the organisation. Some people will have dual tagging, but somebody needs to be thinking about that. The Chief Data Officer is an emerging role. It's certainly something that we put in place at IP Australia when I was there because it just needed somebody who was thinking about data from the perspective of data, who wasn't thinking about it just from an IT perspective or just from a business perspective. And I do think there's a really important bridging role there. And I think success does come down to being able to answer clearly, what do we actually want to be able to achieve with this? And a strategy success is, well, what are we going to do with the data? And I think we've got a really clear vision about what you want to do. The rest of it often falls into place. The best examples in my lived experience came from clients who really knew exactly what they wanted and they weren't able to achieve that given the data that they had at that point. And common sense just says when you're talking to senior executives, what am I getting out of this is a really good starting point. So,
perhaps one more. Up the back.
Just interested in your opinion about how do you think data release and data sharing fits in that data governance? Should we introduce it as a sector there, or where do you see it?
ooh.
DMBOK version 3.
DMBOK, yeah, where should it sit in you? Where is the damn thing? Go forward. That's probably something that requires a bit more thought. I'll give you my instinctive reaction, which is it may not be part of this picture. I think it's actually a separate question. If you included it in the wheel, I think it would actually potentially detract from what are the foundations to managing data in an effective way. Data sharing, data release is something that you do, generally you only do when you're confident of a bunch of the factors that actually sit in that wheel. So I think it's a slightly different concern. And there are more diagrams in that book than just this one. So maybe it's somewhere else in there that I just haven't noticed. So, that's my instinctive reaction. So, yeah.
All right, I think we might wrap up there. You're hanging around for a few minutes? Okay, so more questions? Grab Deborah personally on, but once again, thank you very much.
No problem.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Love to hear from you again. All right, there will be drinks and nibbles shortly.
Take my time.
Yeah, no, absolutely.